just kind of glanced off, looked up into the crowd, and he just flashed at my head 2 feet away. And I just went like that as to swing at it like at a fly.
Bruce Lee did something on camera that the martial arts world has never stopped arguing about. Vic Moore, a 4-time world champion, one of the most feared fighters in the country, stood 2 feet away and dared him to move. What happened next was over before anyone in that room could process it. One side of martial arts history says what Bruce Lee did that day was the fastest hand ever caught on film. The other side called him the biggest liar ever. They said the entire moment was staged to protect his reputation. Both sides cannot be right. And what the footage actually proves when you slow it all the way down will completely change which side you believe. And we are about to show you everything. The making of a challenger. Bruce Lee's fists were shaking, but not from fear. He was standing backstage at the Long Beach International Karate Championships in 1967, and out in that arena sat Chuck Norris, Mike Stone, and Joe Louis, 3 of the deadliest karate champions in America. Every one of them had come to watch him. Every one of them was waiting to see if the rumors were true, or if this so-called kung fu prodigy was about to get exposed in front of the whole country. If Bruce failed tonight, his name would be finished before it even started. So, how did a street brawler from Hong Kong end up standing in front of America's biggest karate legends with everything on the line? Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco in 1940, but Hong Kong is where he grew teeth. He fought constantly as a teenager, and these were not schoolyard shoves. These were bloody, dangerous street fights that terrified his own parents. The trouble got so bad that his family made a desperate decision. They shipped him off to America, hoping distance would save him from a path that was heading somewhere fatal. Before Bruce Lee crossed the ocean, somebody needed to take that raw violence and turn it into something controlled and lethal. That somebody was a quiet, unknown teacher named Ip Man. Now, here's a twist most people never hear. Ip Man was nobody special back then. He was running a small, forgettable school in Hong Kong, and it would take years, and Bruce's own explosion into fame, before the rest of the world ever learned his name. Ip Man himself had already lost everything once, too. He fled mainland China when the communists tore his world apart, watched his wealth and status vanish overnight, and clawed his way back from nothing in Hong Kong. So the man shaping young Bruce Lee already understood exactly what it meant to lose everything and rebuild from the ground up. Wing Chun, the style Ip Man drilled into Bruce, had no room for softness. Forget the flashy, theatrical moves you saw in Chinese opera. This was close range, brutal, and built to end a fight fast. Attack in a straight line. Waste nothing. Bruce absorbed everything in record time, but he could never just sit still and accept it either. Why block one way when another way could kill faster? Why chain yourself to a single style when every fighting system on Earth has something worth stealing? That restlessness burned in Bruce for the rest of his life, and it would eventually turn him into something nobody in the martial arts world had ever seen coming. When Bruce landed in America in the late 1950s, he did not walk into some warm welcome. He landed broke, restless, and hungry to prove himself in a country that had never seen what he could do. Bruce worked odd jobs just to survive while he searched for a way to build something real and unforgettable. In 1959 in Seattle, Bruce Lee crossed paths with a man named Taki Kimura, and that meeting would change both of their lives forever. Kimura was not some random student walking through the door looking for a hobby. He was a broken man. Years earlier, during World War II, Kimura and his entire family had been ripped from their home and locked away in a Japanese-American internment camp. taken away just one day before he was supposed to graduate high school. He came out of that camp with no diploma, no money, and no direction, forced to work in his family's small grocery store just to survive. He was, by his own account, downtrodden and completely lacking motivation when he met Bruce. Bruce saw something in Kimura that nobody else bothered to look for, so he pulled him into his training. Together, in the basement of that same grocery store, they built Bruce's very first kung fu school from nothing. Kimura became Bruce's first assistant instructor, and their friendship grew into something almost unbreakable. He would go on to stand as best man at Bruce's wedding years later, and after Bruce died, Kimura would carry his casket. That basement club was not some quiet, tame little operation either. Bruce refused to limit his teaching to only Chinese students, and that decision enraged the local Chinese martial arts community, who believed their techniques should never be taught to outsiders. Bruce ignored the backlash completely and kept training anyone willing to work. An African-American judo champion named Jesse Glover was even among his students. Over time, Bruce and Kimura built what quickly became one of the most racially mixed martial arts schools in the entire country. That defiance would eventually catch up to Bruce Lee. In 1964, Chinese martial arts leaders in Oakland grew so furious over Bruce teaching non-Chinese students that they sent a fighter named Wong Jack Man to challenge him directly. The terms were brutal and clear. If Bruce lost, he had to stop teaching outsiders or shut his school down for good. Bruce fought Jack Man and won, and that single fight protected his right to teach anyone he chose. It also exposed real cracks in the rigid, traditional Wing Chun techniques Bruce Lee had leaned on his whole life. And that frustration is exactly what pushed him to start building something entirely new. A fighting system with no borders and no rules chaining it down. By then, Bruce's schools had spread from Seattle into Oakland and Los Angeles. He trained boxers, karate fighters, and quietly, behind closed doors, he trained people from inside Hollywood too. Actors desperate to move and strike the way he did on screen. That private circle was exactly what caught the eye of film producers, and it is the reason Bruce Lee landed the role of Kato in The Green Hornet. By the time he walked back into Long Beach in 1967, he was not some unknown martial artist chasing respect anymore. Bruce had a face people recognized on television and a name that could be dragged through the mud in front of the wrong crowd. But none of this came without a war of its own, and the resistance against Bruce stretched far beyond one angry Oakland dojo. Karate was booming across America. Judo carried real Olympic weight, and boxing sat comfortably at the top of every combat sport in the country. So Kung Fu, to a lot of these fighters, sounded exotic and unproven, maybe even laughable. And it went deeper than just style. Chinese martial artists like Bruce Lee were often met with extreme hostility inside the tournament world, where plenty of fighters openly dismissed Kung Fu as inferior to the Japanese and Korean systems that already ruled the scene. That hostility is exactly what Bruce Lee had to smash through, and tournaments became the only battlefield where he could actually prove it, instead of just talking about it. His first real breakthrough came in 1964 at that same Long Beach tournament, where his one-inch punch and his blinding hand speed left the entire crowd stunned into silence. That single demonstration was what put Bruce Lee in front of the right people in Hollywood, and 3 years later, he was walking back into that same arena carrying far more weight on his shoulders than before. Bruce was sharper now, faster, and this time he was not there to introduce himself. He was there to prove that everything people whispered about him behind his back was true. But proving that in front of legends like Norris, Stone, and Lewis meant Bruce Lee had to hand them something they had never seen before in their lives. And in a few minutes, that was exactly what he was about to do. 8 punches, 1 reputation. Vic Moore locked eyes with Bruce Lee and felt something shift in the room. Moore was a 4-time world karate champion and a 10-degree black belt, a man feared across every tournament circuit in the country. And he had walked onto that stage certain he could handle whatever this kung fu showman was about to throw at him. Moore had no idea what was about to happen to his reputation in the next few seconds. Before Moore ever stepped up, Bruce had already ripped gasps out of the crowd. He had dropped into his famous 2-finger push-ups with his whole body locked straight as a blade, balanced entirely on 2 fingers pressed into the floor. Even hardened fighters in that crowd sat there stunned, because this was not some cheap circus trick. This was raw, brutal strength built through years of merciless training. Then Bruce blindfolded himself completely and called his student, Taki Kimura, onto the stage. Kimura came at him with punch after punch, kick after kick, and Bruce Lee intercepted every single one, moving like he could feel the attacks coming before Kimura even threw them. The crowd had no idea what that moment meant to the 2 men actually standing on that stage. This was not some hired stranger Bruce Lee had grabbed at random for a cheap trick. This was the same broken man Bruce had pulled out of a grocery store basement years earlier. A man who had walked out of a wartime internment camp with nothing left in him. No diploma, no money, and barely any hope. Bruce had rebuilt Kimura from that wreckage, piece by piece, in exchange for nothing but loyalty and hard work. Watching them move together, the crowd saw blind trust between a teacher and the student he had personally pulled back from ruin, but what they never realized was that they were watching years of real friendship compressed into a few seconds on a stage. That was what made the demonstration land the way it did. It was not a stranger reacting to a stranger. It was 2 men who had already survived their own private wars together, now showing the world what that bond could do under pressure. Then Vic Moore walked onto that stage, and the entire arena leaned forward. Now, here's something the story almost never tells you. Moore was one of the first black karate champions to break into a tournament scene that was overwhelmingly white at the time. He had clawed his way up through a system that did not make room for him easily, winning titles and respect the hard way, 1 tournament at a time, against men who did not want to see him win. So whatever was about to happen between these 2 men carried a weight that went far beyond mere points on a scoreboard. Bruce laid out the challenge, calm and direct. "I'm going to throw a punch at your face," he told Moore. "All you have to do is stop it before it lands." No knockout was needed, just 1 clean block, and Moore would win. Sounds so simple, right? Every trained fighter on Earth spends years learning how to block a punch. But this was never a test of strength. This was a test of speed, and speed at a level almost nobody in that arena had ever witnessed up close in their entire lives. Bruce settled into his stance and barely moved. Then his fist exploded forward and stopped a breath away from Moore's face before Moore's body even registered a punch was coming. The crowd gasped. Bruce reset. He threw it again. Same result. Again and again. Attempt after attempt, Moore's hand never moved fast enough to catch him. Even when the footage was slowed down years later, the camera still could not keep up with Bruce's motion, which tells you exactly how violent and fast this really was, live, in the moment, with no retakes and no mercy. That single piece of footage became so important to Bruce's legend that it never stayed untouched. For decades, outlets like Black Belt magazine cut and recut the exact clip in different versions. Even historians who have picked apart the surviving reels still argue over which attempts were kept in, and which ones were quietly buried. Just think about what that actually means for a second. A moment that lasted only a few seconds on a stage in 1967 was later handled, shaped, and repackaged by editors making decisions about what the public should and should not see. Remember that detail, because it matters more than it sounds like it should right now. And we are coming back to exactly why before this story ends. That night, the biggest names in American karate watched this exact sequence rip through the room, and it planted the seed for everything Bruce Lee would build afterward. Intercept the attack before it ever arrives. Do not wait to react. Get there first. That single idea would eventually become the foundation of the fighting system Bruce would build and name Jeet Kune Do, a system born directly out of this exact stage, in front of these exact men, on this exact night. But speed alone never told the whole story with Bruce Lee. What good is being the fastest man in the room if your punch cannot actually hurt anybody? Bruce understood that better than almost anyone alive at the time, and what he showed the crowd next would prove his hands were not just fast. They were genuinely dangerous. The inch that broke a man's body. A grown man stood frozen in front of Bruce Lee, with his jaw clenched, and Bruce's fist resting a single inch from his ribs. Now, just pause a second and ask yourself something. If a fist rests that close to your body, with barely any room to swing, how much damage could it possibly do? Your gut tells you not much. It looks more like a shove than a real strike. But Bruce Lee spent years proving that gut feeling dead wrong, and this volunteer was about to find that out the hard way in front of an entire arena. Bruce told him to brace himself. Then, with almost no visible wind up at all, he fired off one short, explosive strike. The man was launched backward through the air and crashed straight into the crowd of bystanders behind him. He needed a few seconds afterward just to catch his breath and steady his legs again. This was not a staged theater. A real body had just absorbed a real, violent hit, and everyone standing close enough watched it happen with their own eyes. Even when you slow the footage down frame by frame, Bruce's own body barely shifts during the punch. So how does almost no visible movement create that much force? The answer is not some secret mystical trick passed down through legend. Bruce Lee trained his fast-twitch muscle fibers relentlessly for years, and he learned to fire his hips, shoulders, and legs together in one unified blast, all within a fraction of a second. Most fighters generate force like that over the full swing of an arm. Bruce crammed that same force into a distance most fighters would consider useless for any real power at all. That compression is the real innovation here. Bruce did not invent a new kind of force. He found a way to unleash a familiar kind of force from a distance nobody else believed was possible. Bruce Lee also stole something directly from fencing, a sport he studied obsessively on his own, spending hours breaking down footwork and timing most martial artists of his era never even looked at. He treated the punch less like a boxer's blow and more like a sword thrust, sharp, direct, and impossible to see coming in time to stop it. This flipped everything boxers were taught at the time. In boxing, fighters keep their strongest hand held back, saving it for a big cross or hook later in the fight. Bruce tore that idea apart. He made his lead hand, the one closest to his opponent, his primary weapon, and trained it to be fast, accurate, and brutally destructive all at once. Trainers who studied his method later admitted this single reversal alone would have taken most fighters years to even consider, because it broke a rule almost nobody questioned. Years later, sports scientists studied high-speed footage of the one-inch punch to figure out exactly how it worked. What they found was a rapid, whip-like chain reaction firing through Bruce's joints in strict sequence, each one exploding right after the other within a fraction of a second. This was not folklore anymore. This was a real, documented attempt to understand a technique most people at the time swore was flat-out impossible. Researchers pointed to this exact sequencing as the reason the punch could travel almost no distance and still generate enough force to lift a grown man off his feet. To put the raw numbers in perspective, modern research on trained boxers shows a full power punch can generate over 1,000 pounds of force. Bruce's 1-inch punch was never measured in a lab during his own lifetime, so let's be honest about that gap. What we do have are decades of expert estimates suggesting his punch could rival or even beat that same number, despite starting from almost no distance at all. Nobody ever nailed it down with hard proof, and that uncertainty has not stopped the fighting. If anything, it has fueled an argument that has raged for over 50 years, with martial artists and scientists still debating exactly how much force a punch that short could truly carry. That uncertainty came with real, bloody consequences outside of controlled demonstrations too. Practitioners who tried to copy the 1-inch punch on people who were not properly braced for it have caused genuine injuries over the years, including cracked ribs and torn soft tissue. Some students attempting to replicate the technique without proper guidance ended up hospitalized, learning the hard way that this was not a party trick anyone could safely copy at home. The difference between a demonstration and a disaster often came down to whether the person on the receiving end knew exactly how to absorb that kind of short-range violence. Bruce's own volunteers were prepared for it, briefed and braced ahead of time. Plenty of people who tried to copy it later were not so lucky, and they paid for it with their bodies. Bruce reportedly performed a version of this same demonstration on national television years afterward, and professional athletes, even trained strongmen who felt it firsthand, described the impact as closer to getting hit by a moving truck than getting pushed by a hand. Think about that for a second. These were men whose entire careers were built around predicting and absorbing brutal physical force, and even they got blindsided by what a single inch of distance could unleash. Some of them reportedly asked to feel it a second time, refusing to believe their own bodies the first time around. For Bruce Lee, this was never just a party trick to wow a crowd. It struck at the very core of what he believed about fighting. Why waste time on elaborate, decorative movement when one direct strike, delivered with total precision, could end everything in an instant? That belief shaped the entire fighting philosophy he was building, and it is exactly why what happened next mattered so much, both to Bruce's legacy and to the one man who has spent over 50 years insisting that legacy was never built on the whole truth. The man Bruce Lee erased. Now, here's the question this whole story has been building toward. What if the unbeatable punch you just watched, the one praised for decades as untouchable, was never the full picture at all? And what if the one man who could prove it has spent over 50 years screaming into a silence nobody wanted to hear? Vic Moore was not some minor name thrown into this story for effect. He was a 10-degree black belt and a 4-time world champion, a man with a real, blood-earned reputation built across the toughest arenas in the country. So if anyone alive could expose a crack in Bruce Lee's armor, it was him. The version that spread across the world for decades is simple and brutal. Bruce Lee threw 8 punches at Moore's face. Moore failed to block a single one. His hand stayed frozen the entire time, beaten cold by pure speed. But Moore has told a very different story for over 50 years, and it deserves to be laid out in full, instead of buried in one dismissive sentence. According to Moore, the two men agreed beforehand that the punches would go to the chest, not the face. He says he blocked the first 2 attempts cleanly, exactly as agreed. Then, According to Moore, Bruce Lee broke that agreement without warning and fired a punch straight at his head instead. And after that happened, Moore claims he struck back and landed blows of his own on Bruce. That is not some vague complaint from a bitter man. That is a specific, detailed accusation that has never once changed in 50 years, repeated the same way in interview after interview, decade after decade. To make things even messier, Moore has claimed that privately, away from every camera in the building, Bruce Lee told him he was the fastest American he had ever faced. If that is true, then it slams directly against the public version of the story, the one where Moore never lays a single hand on Bruce at all. But why would Bruce Lee say something like that behind closed doors if the footage everyone saw already told the complete truth? It is the kind of detail that either proves Moore is telling the truth or proves he is willing to invent something nobody can ever verify. And there is more. Moore has alleged that Bruce's own media team deliberately chose to replay, over and over, the one single attempt that came closest to a clean strike to the face, while quietly burying the other attempts in the sequence, the ones Moore swears he actually blocked or answered. If that allegation holds any truth, then what the world has watched and shared for decades is not a full record of that night. It is a carefully cut highlight reel, shaped and polished to protect one man's image, played and replayed until it hardened into accepted fact. Moore has also claimed that Black Belt magazine's editor at the time deliberately framed the whole story in Bruce's favor and cut the rest of the exchange completely out of the record. That accusation carried enough weight that, decades later, filmmaker Christopher Everett built an entire documentary around it, called Grandmaster, the Vic Moore story, made specifically to finally give Moore's side of that night the attention it never got the first time around. The documentary digs into a man who says he has spent his whole adult life fighting a story that was never fully told. One interview and one testimony at a time. Now, to be fair, this fight over the truth did not stay one-sided. Martial artist Steve Muhammad has backed pieces of Moore's account for years, standing by him publicly even as the mainstream version of the story rolled on without either of them. But on the other side, Bill Wallace, a respected martial artist who says he personally witnessed the entire demonstration, has stated flatly that Moore never blocked a single punch and never landed a single strike on Bruce Lee that night. Two credible men with two completely different memories of the exact same few seconds. That is the raw, uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this entire story. And it is exactly why the argument has never been settled, no matter how many people online insist otherwise. What happened to Vic Moore after that night says just as much as the demonstration itself. He did not vanish into irrelevance. He went on to win 4 world titles, opened multiple respected karate schools throughout Ohio and North Carolina, and later helped bring kickboxing to national television in America for the very first time. He even appeared on a major broadcast that introduced the sport to millions of American households. That is a real legacy, earned through real blood and real work, decades of teaching, competing, and building something lasting long after the cameras at Long Beach had stopped rolling. And yet, for most of his adult life, Moore says strangers only ever recognized him for one single thing: the man who lost to Bruce Lee. He has spent over 50 years fighting to correct a story the rest of the world decided was finished the moment that footage started circulating. So, which version do you believe? Was this the moment that proved Bruce Lee truly unbeatable? Or was it the moment martial arts history quietly picked which side of a two-man argument it wanted to remember forever? Bruce Lee's legendary demonstration at Long Beach lasted only seconds, but the fight over what actually happened in those seconds never ended. Tell us what you think really happened in the comments below. We would love to hear it.